Welcome to the Faith and Feelings podcast. My name is Taylor Joy, and I'm passionate about helping you untangle and honor your emotions, authentically practice your faith, and integrate both into your everyday life so that you can experience the goodness and delight that comes from living in relationship with yourself, God, and others. Thank you for joining me. Let's get started. Dallas Willard once said, "The most important thing about us is not the decisions that we make, but the person we're becoming." That brings us to the final relational skill in this series, which involves nurturing a growing spirituality that enables us to love God and others well. This calls for an intentional, purposeful plan. To truly implement what we've learned over the last few months and to reverse decades of unhealthy ways of living and operating requires thoughtfulness. One way to do this is by drawing on an ancient treasure from the Christian tradition called a rule of life. Simply put, a rule of life is an intentional, conscious framework for keeping God at the center of everything we do. It's a unique combination of embodied practices that provide structure and guidance in our experience of God, helping us remember Him in our daily rhythms. To wrap up our series on emotionally healthy relationships, Carley and I share some rhythms and practices from our own rules of life and offer practical steps for creating one of your own. Listen in.
Hi guys, welcome to our last episode.
I can't believe we're already at our last episode, Carley. This has been so fun to do together.
So fun.
Yeah, I think I feel both a little sad and just really grateful as we wrap up today. And today we're closing the series by talking about something that isn't exactly a relational skill, but more of a framework or a container, a way of holding all the practices we've been exploring, and it's called a rule of life. So to start us off, Carley, how would you describe what a rule of life is and why it matters for our spiritual lives today?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. Every time I teach this, I'm always like, I wish I would have learned this younger. Because I grew up in the context of like learning spiritual disciplines and practicing them. But oftentimes it really did feel like goal oriented and like checking off lists and doing all the right things. And so what the rule of life has really taught me is that it's not so much about like an end goal, but rather like a dance to like a music, like a rhythm. And so rule of life, often people like immediately get like intimidated. They're like, oh, rule. Like even the word rule like makes us kind of like, wait, what am I doing it right? You know, but that's not at all what it is. A rule of life actually comes from the Greek word trellis. And it's about this, like, and if you know what a trellis is, if you have any gardening experience, trellises just stand in one place and they allow for growth of flowers and vines to kind of wrap around them and move upward. And so it's such a beautiful image of what the spiritual journey is in this idea of growth, and it happens slowly over time. And there's such a nuance to this. And so the trellis is almost like the structure in which we practice becoming more mature in Christ. And so rather than having like an end goal, it's rather like, what am I doing intentionally over time, over periods of time. And what my rule of life consists of like daily, weekly, monthly, yearly. And so we have a structure, right? And then within that, we kind of say, what's important daily, what's important weekly, what's important monthly, what's important maybe every 6 months or every year. And how that over time, that repetition and that practice allows us to grow in maturity. And so that's my perspective of a rule of life. And having practiced this now for several years, it's really been so much more formative because it takes away that challenge of feeling like you have to kind of meet some sort of goal, because it's less about goals and more about rhythms and intentionality. And those change, just like music, the melody changes and seasons change. Our rule of life adapts and changes with us. So there's much more flexibility in this, and it allows us to be intentional about our growth.
Yeah, that's so good. How would you describe the main distinctions between the rhythms and practices of a rule of life and traditional goal setting? Like, how do you see those two things as different?
I think the easiest way I would say is a rule of life is about intentionally becoming aware of God in the way that we live, whereas a goal is focusing on a thing, if that makes like an outcome of meeting with God. So like the rule of life is about meeting with God, right? And so that's how I distinguish the two, right? Because it in and of itself is the goal, right? So it's not so much like oh, I have to do this over and over to get to a goal, but rather every single rhythm that I choose to be in is an invitation to be with God. And that feels different for me because there isn't an agenda in that. It's truly just to be with God. And if we're going to connect this to our skills that we've learned, it's also then, we can relate this to people too. Like, this is how I intentionally want to show up with people and with God, right? Because even being with another person, we're being with God, right? Because God lives in others. And so this beautiful idea of like intentionally pursuing relationship, both with ourselves, God, and others, is how I differentiate it versus kind of, I have to be this kind of person, so I'm going to practice this skill, because it takes the relational piece out.
I'd love to hear the story of your first rule of life.
Yeah.
So what was going on in your life at the time that you created it? And as you reflect back, what are some of the ways that you've noticed this practice influencing your relationships and the way you show up in them?
Yeah, I feel like I had a rhythm. I didn't call it a rule of life, but I definitely had a rhythm from when I was pretty young. I would say like maybe college age. There was just this rhythm of meeting with God, but I didn't know what a rule of life was. And so when I got that language, it was probably in my mid-20s when I got that language. And I was like, oh, this is a great way to look at it. I love that, because it allowed me to not be so performative in my mindset. I think specifically when we're talking about rule of life in context to spiritual disciplines, it can feel that way. And so really trying to kind of heal from the performative or moralistic practice of it, but more of how am I being intentional about my relationship? Just like I would spend time with anybody on a consistent basis that I love. How am I doing that? And how am I allowing God to draw me to himself, making space and time for that? So I think, yeah, mid-20s. And the biggest piece of that for me, I think, was Sabbath keeping. I had really never heard that. I had never really grown up with that. Although I knew what Sabbath was, I didn't practice that until my mid-20s. And that was revolutionary for my process because I had never learned to just sit and be, and be delighted in, from separate from what I did for God. And so this was like a beautiful moment of, and it still is a practice that reminds me that I can be before I do.
How did your life start to change once you began practicing a rule of life?
It definitely slows it down because, right, when we're being more intentional about things, we have to say no to certain things, right? So for me, I think even I would say the last like 6 to 7 years, that ability to renegotiate could be a good word, or re-envision, to be able to say no to more things so I can say yes to the right things. That I think really did that. The catalyst for that was creating a rule of life and being really intentional about my life. Because I don't know, especially at our age and in this kind of society, it can be so easy to just kind of get like swept in the current of life and whatever we're pursuing, and really not be intentional. And even for singles, if I can speak on that for just a second, it's even harder because I think we have this mentality that like when I'm married or when I have a family or when this particular thing might happen in my life, then I'll have more structure. But in actuality, we're all invited into that, like that discernment process and intentionality. We can have that now. We don't have to wait. And so I think that's been also a beautiful piece for me to see how it's changed my the way I show up in relationships, but also the way life feels. It doesn't feel so chaotic.
Yes. Yes. Could you walk us through a couple of the rhythms or practices in your role of life that have been most significant or meaningful for you?
Yeah. So one for me is like silence and solitude. That is so important, because a lot of even the skills work that we've talked about starts with being quiet and listening to God and noticing what's showing up for me so I can invite God into that. And so that's a huge piece that's been a significant daily rhythm for me for a while. And then in corporation with maybe scripture reading in various forms. And then Sabbath is a weekly rhythm that I think I've already mentioned that is really formative for me. Hard. It's still hard, and I think it always will be. Stopping is hard. And then I would also say like the relational rhythm. I would say that like being with people, whether that be on Sundays at church or having a meal with a friend, in some capacity, doing something outside of myself, is also like a significant rhythm in my process, because it allows me to use these skills that we've been talking about, right? It's one thing to be with God and to learn all the things and to know what's happening inside of me. It's another to put it into practice. And so for me, like serving in my church or, more social activities with friends. And those are where I get to really practice like listening well and process, sharing values and working out some of these skills in day-to-day relationships.
Yeah, that's so good. There's a quote I read a few years ago, probably one you've heard of, by a Jewish rabbi that's really shaped my own rule of life. And he says, if you work with your hands, Sabbath with your mind. And if you work with your mind, Sabbath with your hands. A lot of my work, like yours, I think, involves my mind and relational capacity. So much of my rule of life is built around intentional rhythms to balance that, like taking walks, practicing silence and solitude, limiting screen time, and having fun with friends. And I've been reflecting on how these rhythms and practices help me bring a healthier version of myself to my relationships so I can show up more fully and actually practice the skills we've been exploring in this series.
Yes. Yeah. It's so intentional, isn't it? It's, I think anybody can get caught up in a performative process, right? And so I think that to be really clear, God, I think this is Dallas Willard, it might be someone else, but I think it's the phrase that says something along the lines of like, God is not opposed to effort. He's opposed to earning. And I just love that framework for this because it does take a lot of effort. And we're not talking about not having effort, because anything that we want and desire takes effort, but it's about earning. Like we're doing this from love, and for the, like love can only be loved into us. Like I love that kind of concept of like, the more I set up times to be loved by God and loved by others, the more I am accessing my ability to love and grow in that love. And so it just is it's just a different frame of reference to be able to like hold space for that and to say like the purpose of all of this is love, to grow into being a disciple. And Jesus says that like you will know my disciples because of how they love one another. So
yeah, and this back and forth process of receiving and giving love is ultimately the heart of the rule of life. Just like you were saying, it's the purpose behind this practice.
That's right. Exactly.
So when you think about your rule of life, is there a rhythm or practice that maybe didn't come naturally at first, but that has ended up being really formative for you?
I would say other than Sabbath keeping, because that is a hard one. I would say my second one would probably be solitude. That's a practice that I've increased, I would say, in even just like you were saying, because my work is so much with people, being able to get alone and quiet so I can listen is so helpful and so hard. Being quiet is so hard. Sometimes even like if I'm with friends or like if we're traveling and I'm with a group of people, I'm such an external processor. I'm such an extrovert that like, I'll just want to talk. like I'll be sitting with I'll be reading and like trying to be quiet. And I'm like, I just keep talking. So I'll have to be like, I'm going to another room, guys. I need to go sit over here and be by myself, because if someone's in the room, I'm going to want to talk to them. And so that practice, I like giggle about it because it is so true, but it's also something that I'm learning to like get away with God and like be quiet with myself. And that's something that has become really precious to me, but is very, I would say, has been really stretching to cultivate.
Yes. It's so funny that you say that, because I am such an external processor. Every single week you will find me externally processing in Carley's office.
It's great. I love it.
Has anything surprised you about your own rule of life? Maybe a practice you didn't expect to need but found to be especially helpful?
Yeah, I think the one that I would say has really formed me, and in ways I wouldn't have imagined, is that silence practice. I learned how to pray, the Lord's Prayer. Prayer was very much a way of telling God things, externally processing with God, which is great. Love it. Do it all the time. But silence is a way of listening to God that I'm just constantly blown away by. I mean, there's so many stories I could tell of just what that has cultivated in my life, but it is a hard thing to lean into. One, because I think I'll speak for myself. Because I think I tend to get cluttered with lots of thoughts and have so many ideas all the time. And so getting quiet is just difficult. But then also discerning the voice of God is something that maybe we don't talk about enough. I surely didn't growing up. And so it is beautiful to see how that silence and solitude can cultivate a deeper understanding even of Scripture, and how God like uses both. I could speak more to that, but it has been a really beautiful journey.
Yeah. Well, we're going to get into how to develop a rule of life in just a minute. But when we think about starting this process, I think what you mentioned earlier about flexibility and adapting a rule of life as seasons change is really important. So before we get into the specifics of creating one, what does it look like to adjust a rule of life when life shifts, maybe to a new year, or parenting, or grief, or transitions, or other seasons? How do we stay flexible without losing intentionality?
That's so good. Yeah, I wonder if there's so many things I could speak to this, but also I think there's a handout in the back of the workbook that I highly recommend for those that are going to get it, that just talks about the frequently asked questions about creating a rule of life and how we shift and change that. And I'm trying to look for it as we're speaking, but I can't find it. Anyway, the idea here is that there's so much grace. And I think that's the challenge when it comes to creating any sort of structure for things, is that maybe we can get a little bit stuck on I have to follow it exactly. But this is more about where can I find space, and what does that look like in this season of my life? Right? I use the phrase all the time, and I laugh because my clients sometimes are like, "Oh, I hate that phrase," but then they use it, and I'm like, "See, it's helpful, isn't it?" Right now, what do I need right now? Right? What do I have capacity for right now? And so there's no time in life where a rule of life can't be had, because we all have a rule of life. Maybe we're just not intentional about it, right? If your rule of life is, coming home from work, as it was for me for a long time, coming home from work and just being so exhausted, sitting on the couch and watching TV until I fall asleep, that is a rule of life. That's the rhythm that we're having. And not to say that that's negative in some ways, because it's showing us what we're tired, we're exhausted, we need some way of relaxing. And so it's being intentional about it. Is that relaxing? What I noticed for me is it wasn't actually relaxing. It was very disassociative for me, right? It was a distraction from what was going on inside of me. And so being able to make those small changes in certain seasons of my life where it actually created more space, it actually created more rest. And so I think of it more like a lifeline than oh my gosh, in this season of my life, I can't do the things. Okay. That's okay. What what do we need then in this season to feel connected to God and others and to self, right? Like maybe that's the way I would frame it for people. And specifically in certain situations, like with children, with, with grief or crisis, that's a whole different conversation. Because in a lot of places and spaces like that, we're just surviving, right? Like just get to the next stage. Like, can I get some sleep at night? But we can invite God into all of those things. If you're grocery shopping, you can invite God into that. It's how you speak to the person at the counter, or, it's about living intentionally. And so even in those different seasons in our life, like we've talked about this, Taylor, like in grad school, it looks so different than it will when, you're out, not in grad school. And I remember that transition in my life. And so being able to notice in this particular season I'm in, what is it that I need in order to be intentional about my relationships? That's kind of the invitation, I think.
For listeners who want to start developing a rule of life, could you walk us through some beginning steps? Where is a good place to start?
Yeah. I would encourage people to explore emotional healthy spirituality, which is the other context to this emotional healthy relationships, because it has a whole like structure for creating just a complete rule of life. But even if we were going to just take for right now one or two of the skills that we've processed through in the last few months and said, okay, I want to create a rule of life around practicing one of these skills, right? I think like the temperature reading is a really helpful one, or the ladder of integrity even, or exploring the iceberg. That's an easy one, right? That's something we could maybe commit to weekly or daily even. And so I would say start small. If we're going to build out a whole rule of life and be like, okay, I'm going to start, doing silence and solitude and start, silence and prayer and Sabbath keeping and practicing these skills, right? It's going to be really overwhelming. And so we don't want to set ourselves up for not being able to do that. We think, thinking like, okay, start small. So picking 1 to 2 things, like what does it look like to be intentional about my relationship with my relationship with connecting with God and connecting with others. And so maybe that's one of the skills. Just pick one of the skills that we've listened to over the past few weeks and say, okay, I'm committed to doing this skill on a daily basis, a weekly basis, a monthly basis, whatever you can fit into your calendar. And then choose who you're going to do it with. Maybe it's just with yourself and God. Maybe it's you do it with yourself, and then you also have a friend or a family member to help kind of walk you through it weekly or talk with you and discuss it. So it's so creative and so flexible, but I would say that the first step, I would encourage people to just identify 1 to 2 things, 1 to 2 skills, 1 to 2 spiritual disciplines that feel like important to practice and try out to see if that helps their intentionality. And then see how it goes. And the best thing about this is we evaluate and then try something else, right? It's like kind of like trial and error. Try it out, see how it goes, get curious about what you're experiencing, and then you can always adapt and change it to what fits your life right now.
Yeah, that's so good. Well, as we wrap up, are there any final encouragements or reflections that you would like to offer our listeners as we close out this series?
Yeah, I think I always end this with going back to Matthew 5 and the exhortation of like, you are salt of the earth, right? And you are the light of the world. And this is like so beautiful. That language to me is so beautiful. Like, this is who we are. It's not that we have to try to be. It's not like a, come on, do better. It's like, this is who you are. This is our identity as children of God. And the invitation is to bring that light, that salt, that beauty, that goodness into the world around us. And these skills are such helpful tools to that. The cultivation of Christ in us. And this is just kind of the encouragement, right? To my hope and my prayer for those that have been listening over the past few weeks is just that you will be reminded of who you are and the gifts that like God's love gives us so that we might give it to the world. I think of Henry Nouwen's being chosen, blessed, broken, and given. Like, this is who we are. We've been chosen as beloved children of God, right? And being blessed and broken open in our own lives so that we can then go and be given to the world around us. And so I hope that these skills and things can be a gift and an opportunity to experience that in everybody's lives, as it has been for me.
Yeah, so good. I know I mentioned this before we started recording, but I just want to say it again here. I have learned so much by going through this book with you and exploring all of these different relational skills and concepts. And I'm really grateful for you, Carley, and for the time you've taken to do this series with me.
Yes, it was so fun. Thanks for having me.
Wasn't that so good? As we wrap up this series on emotionally healthy relationships, I want to invite you to spend some time reflecting on a few questions. Which of the skills that Carley and I discussed have been most helpful for you? Which relational skill might God be inviting you to focus on intentionally over the next 3 months, and how could you incorporate it into a rule of life? This final episode really flows into our next series, starting next week, which I've been so excited to tell you about. I'm going to share the topic in next week's episode, so you won't want to miss it. Make sure you're subscribed so you're notified when new episodes are released, and I'll see you next week. I'm so grateful that you listened to today's episode. Thank you for spending time with me. I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me on Instagram at TaylorJoy or through my website, taylorjoymurray.co. Also, if you enjoyed this conversation, it would mean so much to me if you took a minute to subscribe and review the podcast. This is an easy way to partner with me and is invaluable in reaching new listeners. Until next week.